I'm going to get into next. I've got some time left. I want to talk about also what they call new imperialism, which was something that was big that started in the 19th century, and it kind of goes up to World War One. In the late 19th century, you got up to World War One. You got this period where they have an age of imperialism, where all these powers in Europe start to try to create colonies throughout parts of the world. Africa being the most famous, of course, parts of Asia, the Pacific, close to the Indian Ocean, and all of that. And so they often refer to it as being called new imperialism because of the fact that the Europeans were trying to exploit all these areas of the world because of economic reasons, which they think had an extension as part of the age of capitalism, which was beginning in the 19th century, which had to do with also the Industrial Revolution, which we talked about that had already started. And so they wanted cheap natural resources, cheap labor, cheap new markets, to exploit and sell goods to, and also areas to colonize because parts of Europe were becoming, overpopulated, and so they wanted to move to certain areas, be able to own land and things like that overall. You can see this map here. You can see those are the different areas of the world that were, at one point taken over by the Europeans. Africa, most famous, of course, they had the so-called Scramble for Africa, as they called it, where, they start carving up different parts of the world. And even in Asia, of course, you've got the British, especially in Asia, of course, taking over all these areas overall. Of course, there's a difference between old imperialism and new. Old imperialism went back to 16th century, going back to the conquistadors and up to like the 18th century, where conquest of the Americas was the big thing that was starting to kind of take off the most overall. But then you can see new imperialism is more focused on, pushing into parts of Africa and Asia. Those some of the major powers, Germany, Italy, Belgium, they're the ones that kind of were in it, especially the British. The British and the French were the ones that were probably the most famous. United States, Japan also got into it as well. Spain and Portugal were kind of involved too, but they were already kind of involved on certain parts of the world at that time overall. Even the United States got into it, like Manifest Destiny. That's something that we hear about, of course, in the United States, which was a movement to push, all the way to the Pacific Ocean, East Coast to the West Coast in the United States. And you can see here that, eventually all that was territory that was taken from other powers. Louisiana purchased from France. Republic of Texas was gotten mostly from the Spanish. You can see the southwestern areas of the United States, California, Nevada, Arizona, Utah, parts of New Mexico were gotten from the Mexicans. Northwestern part, of course, gotten from the British also as well, like Oregon, Idaho, Washington. Alaska from Russia, Hawaii from the Polynesians. So we took all that territory from other people, over time. And also the Philippines, we go into the Caribbean, and things like that also as well. But I want to talk about the British. Really, when you think of the British, they were the ones that really were the model for people to want to imperialize and colonize different parts of the world. We had talked about how the British Empire at one point controlled something like 1/4 of the world's landmass, especially by the 1920s overall. And their empire at one point would control Canada, part of the Caribbean, British Guiana and South America, Belize in Central America, Egypt, Sudan, Nigeria, South Africa, Rhodesia, I guess, India, Australia, New Zealand, and even parts of like China at one point. So their empire was vast, in size. And I think the size of their empire at one point was like 11 to 12 million square miles, which was a huge, huge amount of territory. Imperialism was also part of, don't forget, national pride. And so you had this case where people had what they call jingoism, where they felt like they had a right to go into these areas and spread, uh, their ideas and civilize people and things like that. And you may have heard of this writer named Rudyard Kipling, who he's one that wrote the famous book called The Jungle Book. You may have read or maybe seen movies about the Jungle Book. But he had a poem that was called White Man's Burden, which kind of summed up, British imperialism, that they had to go in there and civilize people and make them like the British people and things like that. And it's kind of a form of racism now, I guess today is seen as overall. But that's kind of what they saw it as back in the 19th century, roughly. So White Man's Burden, that kind of summed it up. Now, one of the things I'll kind of talk about when you think about they think British imperialism was heavily influenced by this man named Dr. David Livingstone, who lived in the 19th century. You may have heard of him. Livingstone was this Christian missionary that went to Africa hoping to convert all of the Africans to Christianity. But he wasn't just involved in that. He also explored parts of Africa, which I think one of the main things that Livingstone was looking for. He was trying to find the source of the Nile River, which he thought was Lake Victoria. And so he would explore parts of East Central Africa. But they do think that Livingstone was a major influence, of course, on why the British would try to colonize what they called the Dark Continent back then. And there was a time at one point where Livingstone, around 1870, disappeared. They were like, oh my God, they can't find him. They thought maybe he had been killed by Africans. And so the New York Post, I believe was the newspaper, sent this reporter named Henry Morton Stanley to try to find him, if you know the story about this. And he found him near Lake Tanganyika, which is, by the way, close to where Tanzania is today. And he said famously to him, Dr. Livingstone, I presume? And so that became basically the influence of Livingstone. They think also Henry Morton Stanley was an influence because he would later go on to become an explorer himself, exploring Africa. I think Stanley was the one that would actually find the source of the Nile. You'd find like where the rivers go into Lake Victoria and all that. And they believe that Stanley was the one that's going to influence a lot of these other powers to try to colonize eventually afterwards. And it's going to lead to eventually, like Belgium is going to go into like the Congo area, which is in the central part of southern Africa. And they'll colonize that area right there. And under King Leopold II, they'll control that area of the Congo from the 1880s up to the early 1900s, like before World War One. And I don't know if you know about Leopold II. He was kind of infamous for a lot of atrocities happening under him. They exploited mostly the Congo because the Congo had a lot of natural rubber, like rubber trees that were grown there. And so they would harvest the rubber, like the latex liquid from it to make like natural rubber back in those days. Now they have synthetic rubber now also as well. But it caused supposedly millions of deaths throughout the Congo, which I think the number of deaths vary from 1 million to as high as like 15 million Africans may have been killed or somehow died from anything from disease. And they even had cases where they would cut their hands off. I think they cut their hands off because they wouldn't do the work, whatever. And so they chop their hands off, that kind of thing. And so that was considered to be really considered examples of colonialism, how it kind of was seen as very, awful, and some of the negative aspects of it, of course, that would occur to make, rubber, and all that stuff like that at the time. Now, another thing that happened too, because of what happened with Stanley and others going into Africa, the Germans had this conference that they had in Berlin in 1884, which was backed by Otto von Bismarck. And The idea was to divide up various spheres of influence where the Europeans would have their certain areas that they would control. And so it's after that that really Africa gets divided up into these different areas that you see map wise. And so French West Africa, you can see it's mostly in that red area right there, which will include countries like Algeria, parts of like Chad and other areas, Morocco, etc. Those are all the areas that will be controlled by them. The British were all over the place. Nigeria, like I said, Egypt, Sudan, parts of like down into Kenya, also later into parts of East Africa, but especially South Africa will be an area that they'll, of course, control. Spanish, not much in Africa except the western part, of course, there. But Portuguese had areas like where Mozambique is and Angola. Those are areas that the Portuguese control at one point. Of course, Belgium's in the Congo, like I said. Germany had like parts of East Africa, but also Southwest Africa as well. Italy later again, like in Ethiopia as well. But you can see there were very few areas of actual Africa that were independent by the late 19th century. Ethiopia, that's actually one of the last areas that is not actually conquered and taken over by the Europeans, which they called it back in those days Abyssinia, which was an ancient kingdom that went back for hundreds and hundreds of years. And but later it'll be actually conquered by and taken over by the Italians. I think Mussolini later will conquer it. You read about that later, and I think in the 1920s. It'll be later. They do have Liberia. I don't know if you hear about that, but that was another state that was kind of like independent. That really didn't get taken over by the Europeans, but that was a state that America helped to support because there was a movement in the United States back in the 19th century, which was a back to Africa movement where some Africans wanted to go back to Africa and things like that. And so that's what led to its creation and all that and why it exists now, of course, today. I think Marcus Garvey, you may have heard of him. He was an example, a Jamaican American that was kind of involved in trying to start that movement for Africans to go back to Africa. Yeah, you can see the extent of the British Empire, how vast it was, but they had the most colonies, pretty much overall in Africa. But I'll talk about other conflicts that were also big, that were like at the end of the 19th century that you had. You did have this thing called the Boer War, which broke out in what is South Africa. And this was caused by the fact that you had the British slowly taking over South Africa, but you had other people living there that had been there a long time. The Portuguese, the Dutch, go back to like the 16th century in South Africa. And they're often called Afrikaners, of course, later, but the term they used back then was Boer, B-O-E-R, which was a Dutch word that meant farmer, which most of them were. Anyway, because of the fact that the British kept moving in to South Africa, many of them decided to move northward in what became known as the Great Trek, where these mostly Dutch people pushed northward and eastward into, I guess, the eastern part of South Africa today. And they migrated into areas that are now called Natal, Transvaal, you may have heard of, and the Orange Free State, which are now part of South Africa today. And so they migrated there to get away from the British. But the British eventually moved there too. They moved there as well. And they think a lot of that was caused by the fact that they found gold and also diamonds throughout that area that they could mine. And so that's what actually caused the conflicts. And there were actually two Boer Wars. There was one that was called the First Boer War, where they were actually successful, where the Boers were able to get somewhat independent in that area, 1880s. But after they found gold and diamonds in that area, that led to more influx of the British, and that's what they think would cause eventually the so-called Second Boer War to break out, which is actually what they usually call the main Boer War, which was fought between 1899 to 1902. Considered one of the first by the way, first major war, I guess, going into the 20th century, the African areas were outnumbered. They only had about 100,000 troops. You can see those are actually Boer forces on the left, right there. And on the right, the British Empire had like 500,000 troops that they had. You can see some British troops on the right with machine guns right there. And one thing about the Boer War, besides being really one of the first major wars that kind of goes into the 20th century, it is one of the first modern wars that really influences like later World War One. Machine guns, trench warfare, use of camouflage and barbed wire and things like that. A lot of that gets used a lot, of course, in this particular conflict. So trench warfare is something you'll start seeing more of going into like future wars later. And in the end, the Dutch side lost. They lost the war, and so Britain became in more control, over basically South Africa. They also go into like where Rhodesia is now, Zimbabwe, and colonize that area also as well. Which a lot of that had to do with like finding like diamonds and gold also in that area as well. Other conflicts that the British were involved in too, which are very famous, is the Opium War. So I'll kind of talk about that a little bit as well. Which the Opium Wars go back to different parts of the 19th century overall. Which there are actually two of these different conflicts. They had the first Opium War, 1839 to 42, and they had the second Opium War, 1856 to 1880. The Chinese at the time was reigned by this dynasty that was called the Qing Dynasty, or also called the Great Qing or Qing, that ruled China going back to the 17th century, 1644 to 1912. They're sometimes also called the Manchu because they originated in Manchuria. And that state became weaker by the time they got up to the 19th century. And the Europeans start to kind of carve out like spheres of influence over it. And one of the things that the British did was they started to corner the market on opium, it was a narcotic. And eventually the Chinese tried to have it banned, but the British military was just too powerful. And eventually in the Opium Wars, the British Navy practically just wiped out the Chinese Navy, their junk ships. And anyway, basically from there, they were forced to agree to a treaty, which became known as the Treaty of Nanking, which was in 1842. And what it did was it created a bunch of these treaty ports in China on their coast, which the British and other powers could trade there. Like the British got Hong Kong pretty much after that. And then they start getting all these other cities they start to carve up as well, which I've got here. I'll show you, which are a bunch of them. Hong Kong, Shanghai, Canton, you may have heard of course, Nanjing as well, Hankow, Changchao, and Chongqing also were other cities that they eventually take control over and trade with. And so within so many years after that, you can see how China gets controlled by all these different foreign powers, not just European, but Japanese also that come in and control different areas of that area. So Russia's in like Mongolia, Japan controls like Korea, Taiwan, Manchuria, and also parts of eastern China as well. Britain controls like most of the eastern southern part of China, like especially around like Hong Kong and all that. The French are also in control too. French are in like southern part of China and also into Indochina as well. So all these areas are dominated by different foreign powers. Then also the British were in India. Don't forget, India was really the cornerstone of the whole British Empire, especially under Queen Victoria, who reigned from 1837 to 1901. And India was very important because they were a big supplier of a lot of their raw materials to make goods, in the Industrial Revolution. And for a long time, India, going back to like the 18th century, was reigned by this, were controlled by the British East India Company, which originally got their charter, by the way, going all the way back to, you can see, Queen Elizabeth I. That's pretty far back overall. And it was regulated from London, but if you know about it, the East India Company was actually controlled by, they had their own army. The British East India Army that they had some British troops that were in it, like probably the officers, but most of the actual troops that were in it were Indian soldiers, which were called sepoys. And apparently there was an incident that happened in the mid-19th century you may have heard of, that was called they call it different names, the Great Rebellion, I think, of 1857. But a lot of people call it the Sepoy Mutiny or the Sepoy Rebellion of 1857. And what happened was the Indians, mostly in central India, rebelled against the British, which lasted like something like a year and a half that took for them to put down the mutiny. And because of that, the British were forced to take direct control over India afterwards, which they will start in 1858. And so they put in like a viceroy or governor that controls it under the monarch, Queen Victoria, and it was a viceroy. And so after that, India was known as the Raj, is what they called it afterwards. And so from mid 19th century up to like probably right after World War II, the British will control India for many years, which that's an area that's, by the way, Pakistan, India, Bangladesh, I think those are the main areas that were in it. And then also the British controlled, where Burma is, of course, today, or Myanmar. Myanmar is the other name they call it too, as well. But yeah, the British do help to, industrialize the country as well. Don't forget about that, because they help to industrialize, build lots of railroads, throughout the country and modernize it. That's one thing about. I think at the time after they did that, the India had like the third largest railroad network, of course, in the world. There's, of course, the sepoys that revolted. Supposedly they revolted because there was a rumor going around that there was the cartridges that went into the rifles. They're using like fat from like either a cow or from pork, and so they revolted. And they think it was really more like nationalist movement early on, because Mahatma Gandhi later is going to start a whole Indian nationalist movement after World War II to break away. That'll lead to the partition of India, 1947. That's later, 20th century, when that happens. One more thing I'll talk about, too, that was a big part also of imperialism, is the Boxer Rebellion that broke out in 1900. That might have been one of the last major events, of course, of the 19th century that you have. And what happened was we had talked about how the Qing dynasty, the great Qing dynasty, was declining at that time. And there was a lot of resentment in China with these foreigners that were trying to take over the country. And so they think this ignited the so-called Boxer Rebellion, which actually started in 1899 and will last until like 1901. But people often call it that overall. And you have these nationalist movements that started under the Qing dynasty, where they formed these nationalist movements like the Society of the Righteous, I think was one of them, but they had one that was called the Harmonious Fists, which a lot of the Europeans called them boxers because they used like martial arts. They look like boxing, so they're called boxers basically. And they went around with a slogan which was "Death to the Foreign Devils." They wanted to basically kick out all the foreigners out of the country. And it broke out in there's kind of some of the soldiers that were kind of involved in it, but it broke out in Peking, Beijing. That's where the rebellion started. And so 8 different nationalities different countries were involved in trying to put it down. Germany, United States, Japan, and other powers in Europe, Russia, British, etc., all sent forces in there to basically crush it. It's not like 20, 30,000 troops were involved in the actual Boxer Rebellion. And the Boxers killed something like 32,000 Chinese Christians were actually killed, including about maybe 200 Western missionaries. And they think the Boxer Rebellion was pretty bloody. Close to about 100,000 people were actually killed in the Boxer Rebellion. But they do think that the one thing about the Boxer Rebellion, they do think it helped to really cause the decline further of the Qing dynasty, because it's going to eventually collapse in 1912. And what's going to happen is China is going to form a republic, the Republic of China, which was founded by one of the politicians in China you may have heard of, named Sun Yat-sen, considered one of the fathers of the Chinese Republic. So that is one of the last major events, really, that you have, really, of the 19th century that's kind of big, the Boxer Rebellion. But all those events will later help to, like I said, cause, World War I later. The rise of imperialism, rise of nationalism, those are major events focused more, of course, on the 20th century and World War I.